baking in activity to our everyday lives into the built environment. It's such in some ways it's simple, but just such a profound idea. And we're really trying to do the same thing with nature, right? Like going to a park or having nature in your life should be about, getting in a car and driving, 20 miles to a state park. It should be right outside your door. And so this idea that we can engender, smart, context sensitive development that's dense, but also, proximate to nature along trails is, I think, really an idea whose time has come for today with so much demand for natural spaces, coming out of the pandemic. And so this melding of the urban agenda and sort of the parks and green agenda, I think is very exciting.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Zimmerman, and that is Paul Steely White, Executive Director of Parks and Trails New York, and we are going to be walking down memory lane back to the days when he was in New York City, transportation alternatives, and some other fun ventures. But before we do that, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just hit the join button right down below here on YouTube, or navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options. Okay, let's get right to it with Paul Steely White. Paul Steely White, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
Really a joy to be here. Thank you, John.
Paul, this has been a long time coming. I've been wanting to get you on the channel for the longest time. And so I'm super, super stoked to have you here. Now, a lot of people are going to know who you are, but I can guarantee you there's a lot of folks, especially from the international audience, that is like, who the heck is Paul Steely
I think
White?
A lot of people say, who the heck is this guy? Yeah, but thank you. That's very generous. Yes.
I'm going to turn the tables over to you. Who the heck is Paul Steely White?
Well, I'm here in Albany, New York, upstate New York. Like a lot of Brooklynites, moved upstate around the pandemic time and found gainful employment working for this wonderful organization, Parks and Trails New York, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary. And we'll say maybe more about that later, what a great group Parks and Trails New York is. But I've spent my career trying to make the world more bikeable, walkable, more humane. I actually grew up in the Midwest and rode my bike to graduate school from Madison, Wisconsin to Missoula, Montana, which was a great place to do graduate work and environmental stuff. And I went there to study grizzly bear habitat and then realized that the bike scene was much more fun. And so I got into alternative transportation. And this is around the time, I think, the second Ice-T reauthorization of trying to reorient our transportation system in the U.S. A lot of folks were realizing that we'd made some grievous errors in how we were prioritizing our streets and the rest. And so did an internship with the local bike ped coordinator there in Missoula, and then started a correspondence with the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy in New York City, because they were doing such amazing work, and they shared an office with this other wonderful group called Transportation Alternatives. They were all fighting the good fight there in New York and abroad, begging the rest of the world not to follow the U.S. car-oriented model. And so I was casting about for a thesis project. And so I got to go to New York and collect used bikes, and we shipped them to Africa. And then I got to go evaluate these cargo bike microfinancing projects that were started by this wonderful woman who's still very active in the New York bike scene. Her name is Karen Overton, and she pretty much founded, I think, the modern Recycle a Bike movement. But such a brilliant woman, and was working on the urban planning side and the bike project side. I just love that sort of like combination of on the ground bike grease and like policy work. So yeah, I was hooked.
I love it. I love it. I had no idea that there was a Missoula connection in there too. So that's awesome.
Yeah, as you know, Missoula is just a great town for a lot of reasons, and just a wonderful activist community. And I had two colleagues there at the university who started a free bikes program, bike share program there. This is back in the mid 90s. And of course, all the bikes ended up in the river, but it was a great, like they did in Amsterdam. I think the first time they tried the white bikes in the late 60s, right? So It's trial and error until you get it right. But yeah, I learned a lot there, and learned a lot about how, saving the environment is really about getting our own act together as human beings.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too, I love that story of going from Madison, Wisconsin, which of course is just a wonderful bike town. Of course, you've got Trek Bicycles, which is headquartered just outside of the city there. But yeah, one of the classic active towns. It's what I when I talk about. There's a few cities that are out there that are just like quintessential active towns, and Madison, Wisconsin is right up there. Missoula, Montana is right up there. I launched this initiative out of Boulder, Colorado, and Boulder's right there too. Now, did you overlap at all with, I'm trying to think of the era that you were there. It was probably before Jim Sayer took over at Adventure Cycling. So
Jim is wonderful. Yeah, this was the Gary, what's his last name?
Sipple.
Gary Seipel, yes.
Seipel, yeah.
Greg Seipel, who was the founder, and Greg was still there. He and his wife founded Bikes. And believe it or not, I was the receptionist at Adventure Cycling Association for a while.
You got to greet all the people who were like riding their bike. Explain what that's all about.
Oh my gosh. So it's adventure, it's discovery. It's, for those people who know how wonderful it is to discover the world on two wheels, and just to greet these folks coming off the trail, they've been, for thousands of miles, and all they want to do is tell stories. And so you sort of soak it up and listen to them, and they sort of put you there. But Greg was really amazing. He would take these pictures of people when they would come off the trail, because he was just a wonderful photographer, very talented, and capture that sort of like 1,000-yard wondrous stare that people get when they're out there traveling on the, which is now, fast becoming a connected trail that goes coast to coast, right? But they were just pioneers, bicentennial, and really just celebrating all of the wonderful things about bicycling and keeping that sort of flame alit, during the dark era and in the 70s, when so much was happening with, quote, urban renewal and continuing to, pave over various paradises.
Yeah, and I just pulled up the site here for Adventure Cycling, and the other kind of key person who was a part of that, who's very much a part of the urbanism and active mobility, was Dan Burden, who was also very much a part of the early days with that. There's so much history that goes along with this group of characters there. And I do remember popping in there. It must have been 2012. And I was making my way cross country. It was a road trip, not by bike, but I had my racing bike in my car. And I was making my way from Boulder, Colorado, up through the Montanas and heading to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where I was racing in Ironman Coeur d'Alene that year, Ironman Idaho. And so I popped in to Adventure Cycling to say hey to Jim, and he was still the executive
was it in
director.
the church? Because they took over this old church, which is very fitting, right? Because we have this like religious fervor that we bring to the thing. And it was like, there we are.
I didn't get the sense that it was an old church, but what a great organization. Like you said, they've been really working on establishing these routes across North America, and I think working also in collaboration with the Rails to Trails Conservancy too, who's also working hard to create and connectivity of pathways and trails.
Brian Chow, their executive director, is keynoting a conference that we're hosting here in New York in the fall. Maybe we'll get a chance to say something about that later.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Let's definitely put a pin in that and make sure we do that. But I do want to pop back over here to Transportation Alternatives, which is where you landed in New York City, and so that puts you right into the belly of the beast of dealing in the arena of active transportation and advocacy and activism. And you got to love, their current graphics here, Streets for People. And of course, I've got my Streets Are for People coffee mug here. Talk a little bit about that era of being engaged and involved with transportation alternatives. How many years were you there?
Oh gosh, where to start? So I was there for 14 years as executive director. from 2003 or 4 to 2018. But when I landed in 1997 in New York City, thanks to Karen Overton, right, at Recycle a Bike, and she was an active volunteer with both Transportation Alternatives and the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, which was like the international wing of the movement, trying to reform all of the multilateral, bilateral lending, or World Bank, right? They were just funding car projects, and countries where like 1% of people own cars, right? So just great work, but. It's such a storied organization, Transportation Alternatives, founded in 1973 in the really just, groundswell of environmental consciousness and, the oil crisis and, the Clean Air Act and just the activism, right? There's the archive of handbills and posters and photos from protests. Pete Seeger played the first, TA protest at the General Motors building there in Manhattan, right? And, Action Against Automobiles. I think AAA was the first proto name before they landed on Transportation Alternatives. But to come into that scene in the mid to late 90s as a hayseed, essentially from the West, and be welcomed and doing critical mass rides and getting arrested in Central Park and getting to know the network of folks. Charlie Komanoff, of course, is still very, the father of congestion pricing, was very active. And Charlie also was of that same sort of ilk of being, getting sweaty and dirty and being in the trenches, but also just being just like a brilliant policy leader. And I just love that. There was something very honest about it, and that really just attracted me to the work and to the organization. And so when I had the opportunity to come back from Africa, where I was working on various transportation projects and apply for the job in 2003, it was just a dream come true, but the Car Free Central Park campaign, right, was like one of our big ones. And I think maybe we have a photo of that coming up here soon. But the new executive director now, who just started a couple months ago, Ben Furness, I had the pleasure just this past weekend of riding with Ben in the 5-Borough Pizza Challenge, which was founded by Joe Catrufo, who currently leads the charge in Houston. But he was our communications manager there at TA and founded this wonderful event where you go to each borough, eat a slice of pizza, no cars, you get your little pizza passport stamped, and what a fun event. So Ben's already just doing a wonderful job leading, which is really a volunteer-led organization, right? It's all happening on the ground in the boroughs with people who just care so much that they want to reclaim their streets, as we say.
Yeah. Now I remember a lot of the stuff that you were working on. I was very engaged and involved in bicycle advocacy work, primarily where I lived. This was years before I started Active Towns. And so I was very much involved. I was on the board of directors for a nonprofit, and then briefly took over as the interim executive director as we were doing a search. But that was on the big island of Hawaii. So I lived way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for over a decade, basically a decade there on the big island. And so I was very much involved with the advocacy work, and we were following what everybody was doing, what we like to say on the mainland, over here. And so your name would keep coming up, and you were right in the hot spot of so much action. And we can talk a little bit about burnout, especially in nonprofits, and how it's really, really hard to stay engaged decade after decade after decade. So we can talk a little bit about life balance and all that. But you guys were right there at the forefront of so many big fights and wins and bruises and bumps. And so, yeah, one of them was this, where you guys worked hard to get cars out of Central Park.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a more egregious example of sort of the wrong turn we made in the United States with our transportation policy, but to take this absolute gem of a public space, and Robert Moses and others just straightening the wending roads that used to be the exclusive domain of pedestrians and horse carriages, and then basically turning them into highways, in the mid 20th century, and then making it virtually impossible for people to enjoy the park, which is express sole purpose, and so it was really an emblematic and I think galvanizing campaign for the whole movement. And even though it took, 30 plus years to finally make Central Park completely car free, it was I think you hit it on the head, John, when you're talking about just the constant recharging that you have to do as an advocate and celebrating those small wins along the way, where we would eke out a few more car-free hours, on the weekend or during the week, or get a few more entrances closed to cars to reclaim that space. But this was just a story of dedicated, continuous effort by a really strong core of volunteers. I mean, this guy, Ken Coughlin, bless Ken, he collected literally like tens of thousands of petition signatures from park goers and just kept hammering away. And so I was at my best as an advocate when I was just getting Ken coffee and telling him, thank you for all the work you're doing. But it was also, like a lot of our campaigns, a story about coalition building and getting a sort of symphony of not usual suspects, right? Of strange bedfellows, where we would get business interests, economic development, in addition to the usual environmentalists and biking and walking community. And I have to give a ton of credit to Mayor Mike Bloomberg, and of course Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, for helping us really just push this over the hump, so that when Bill de Blasio came in as mayor, it was really a no-brainer for him just to make the whole
to finally make that happen.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, and we'll stick here with the last car, because you were the last car.
This is a really sweet moment where I don't think I even had a driver's license at this point, but I did, and I had to wear the helmet, right? Because we're familiar with all the reasons why,
Oh yeah, you have to. God, yeah.
But Polly Trottenberg, the DOT commissioner at the time, was on a city bike, of course, I think riding next to us. But yeah, this was the ceremonial last car in Central Park. Yeah, wow.
It is interesting too, and one would think that we wouldn't have to fight so hard to do something as simple as making parks more people-oriented places. But, within walking distance from my house is our version of Central Park here in Austin, Texas. And we've got basically a 4-lane motorway ripping right through the middle of Zilker Park. And it's so frustrating and mind-blowing. Fortunately, the city was able to do a lane repurposing and put in protected bike lanes on that same street, Barton Springs Road, leading up to the park, and got that reduced and got that traffic calmed. But we're still stuck on trying to fix the park and make that more people-oriented. Again, it's just mind-blowing that it is so difficult. The other thing that's mind-blowing too is some of the things that we've saw in this era, which is you try to take a step forward and create all ages and abilities facilities for people out there on the streets, and trying to again transform our streets. Streets really are for people into more people-oriented places, and then we get hit with resistance, we get hit with lawsuits. You guys weathered your way through lawsuits. San Francisco had to weather their way through lawsuits as well. Talk a little bit about that. Much tougher time
in San Francisco. Yeah, we never had a massive sort of legal issue with bike lanes like San Francisco had. It was more, as Vince Lombardi would say, a game of inches. Just block by block. And New York City is a very, like a lot of cities, I suppose, is really governed by small sort of fiefdoms at the local level. There's these sort of unelected sort of local mayors who really have a lot of sway, and the community board system. So a lot of that happens in the trenches. I remember Woody Allen coming out against some bike lanes that were being proposed for his street, and everyone would always say, I'm not against bike lanes, it's just this particular one on my street I don't want.
Wasn't there a famous one right next to Prospect Park or something like that?
That was, I think, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan called that the most contested piece of land outside the Gaza Strip, which maybe is a joke that hasn't aged very well. But her point was obviously well taken, which is that it shouldn't have been so contested, right? It was pretty obvious. And it's obvious to everyone now. And that's the real story, right? Whether it's car-free parks or bike lanes or pedestrian streets, once it happens, people scratch their heads and they say, how could it be otherwise?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's insane. Now you mentioned Jeanette Sadik Khan, and we'll focus in on her in a little bit. But there's another famous female that was so impactful around this era as well, and that was the one and only Kate McKinnon.
Oh my gosh! Oh, that one. Yeah. So this blows people's mind, and it blew my 16-year-old daughter's mind when I told her that I ran into Kate a couple months ago at my local coffee shop in New Paltz, New York, right?
Yeah.
2 hours north of the city. And there she was. And, you're not supposed to go up to celebrities, right? You're supposed to just like pretend that you don't see them. I went up to Kate because I remembered her from years ago before she was famous, and she was Veronica Mars doing a parody of a pro-car lobbyist. Yeah,
Veronica Moss.
Thank you.
Moss, yeah.
Moss, not Mars. And it was such a wonderful moment because she's so cool. I mean, this is before she was, but it was obvious to all of us that she was just like not in our league at all.
Right.
And so, I think like this Bloomberg News article, maybe mentioned, it was like the cool girl in school sitting at the nerds lunch table, and,
yeah, exactly.
It's all starstruck. But yeah, she did such a great turn, just, exposing how ridiculous it is to oppose these common sense, humane street improvements. But she was so gracious when I ran into her, when I accosted her a couple of months ago in New Paltz, and she remembered that whole thing, and she remembered the thing, and she was so gracious, and what a wonderful woman, and we were very lucky to have her. Oh, look, there she is.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Clarence. He just absolutely loves that this video just continues to live on. And part of this particular article in Bloomberg is highlighting too the fact that a few of these videos that she did in partnership with Streetfilms, really took off. And it was so funny that she did such a great job on it, just deadpan. And some people were even like, is this person for real? I was like, no, it's not, but it's so well done. Yeah.
Yeah, she's captivating.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But that's I guess that's part of the beauty of being, in New York. It's similar like to my hometown, Los Angeles. It's like, you're in the midst and you can turn the table or turn the corner, and the next thing you know, it's like a famous person is there to also
and I think it underscores a couple of really, I think, profound points about the work. One that you hit on a bit ago, John, which was that you've got to guard against burnout, right? So having these kinds of interactions with these crazy characters is just something that sort of can keep you going, and it keeps the job fun. The other thing you realize is that it's not about the engineering, and it's not even about the politics that matters most. It's about the culture, and so really you've got to tell a better story than the opposition. You've got to get more colorful, awesome people on your side. And right. The more you're doing that, the more you're sort of, the more you're winning, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of which, since we're going to be name dropping here and talking about famous people, again, we were referencing Jeanette Sadik Khan earlier. She's to your right there. And then we've got a few other famous people just popping in to say hello.
Well, yeah, in the middle there, that's Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundation. And this is like a dream, right? Where Jeanette and I were co-awardees. Like, I think that was 2011 of the Jane Jacobs Medal. And it still feels like a dream. But Robert De Niro was getting the medal too that year for his work bringing Tribeca back after 9/11. And it was so fun to be there with Bob. and we were chatting. There we were with our medals on, and we were just sort of chatting. And it felt like that scene in Star Wars, at the end of Star Wars, where like the heroes get the medals. And it was just really otherworldly. But De Niro pulls me close and he says, "You're the guy who did the bike lanes." And I was like, yes, that was all me. And he says, "I don't like the bike lanes." And then, of course, I backtracked. I said, no, it wasn't really me. It was like a community of people who did.
It was her. It was Jeanette.
It was Jeanette. And then he chuckled and he said, "Come with me." And so we went downstairs in the elevator with his whole entourage. We went onto the street and there was this huge black limousine, SUV. And he says, "Talk to my driver. He doesn't like the bike lanes." And so I thought he was sincere, like he sincerely wanted me to like explain the whole thing to his driver. And then I realized after about 2 minutes of heated argument with this with this driver that he was just in it for the entertainment value. He just wanted to see this sort of New
Yeah.
York street
Back and
battle, and
forth.
so we all had a
Yeah.
good laugh. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
really bizarre.
Well, how do we follow up, with Bob and Judith and Jeanette Sadak Khan? Well, obviously we go to the rock star right
Oh my
here.
God. I'm gonna get weepy. I'm gonna get weepy. Yeah, I mean, the last public thing he did was on your show, right? That was like
I think so.
maybe his last.
It's certainly one of the last. Yeah, we recorded that episode in late December. It was premiered on January 10th of this year, and to kick off season 9 of the podcast. And yeah, Don was just so incredibly gracious. I mean, one of the great things about him is just how giving he was, of wanting to get the message out. And but at the same time, I had a few years ago, I had an opportunity to see him give a keynote address. And, there's a handful of people that just can captivate an audience. Gil Peñalosa is one of them, and Don, and a handful of others. It just has the audience just captivated. And he really was like this rock star figure.
Oh, without a doubt. And he had fun. He was funny. And as serious as he was in some sense, because he had the tweed and the very sort of professorial air, he would just love to just hang out and joke. And when he came on, we had this wonderful venue in Times Square, the same venue actually that Jan Gehl made his sort of New York debut, right, where we were trying to get Broadway and all that stuff done. And we had a packed house, because this is maybe a couple of years after we had Jan Gehl. So we had this, we were on a roll. We had all these great speakers coming in and spreading the gospel and evangelizing about all the stuff that needed to happen. And Don was so fun to work with, because not only, you've got the Shoop Dog thing, right? You've got the Shoop Dog, but we played Salt and Peppa's Shoop, if you're familiar with that ditty. It's a wonderful, a wonderful song, but he gets up and he's cutting a groove and dancing and just having total fun with it and making those Seinfeld references, right? Why should I have to pay for it? If I apply myself, I could get it for free.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. For those who don't know that reference, look it up. It's something that George says. And in fact, hey, you even have a slide here about that. Here's the Brooklyn.
Oh yeah, the bike lane
lane
wars of the late aughts. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Prospect Park West. And I've got to just mention Eric McClure from Park Slope Neighbors, who now run Streets Pack. This is probably right in front of Eric's house, or very, very nearby. But what a moment, right? When there was such fervor around that and such friction. But that's when you know that you're making progress, right? When you're bringing all that stuff out into the open, and then average folks and see, wait, those people are protesting what? The ability for kids to bike safely to soccer practice, really?
Right. Yeah.
And it exposes it for what it is, right? Which I suppose is a silver lining, maybe, of a current moment that we're also kind of in. So,
yeah. So let's address the elephant in the room, and that is, again, the long term, being able to do this kind of work for the long haul, and being able to have that life balance, and being able to, keep this going, because I certainly see it out there, especially during really, really tough times. And we've in the last couple of months, we've transitioned into a very, very rough time in terms of especially not knowing where some of the critical transportation funding is going to be, and whether grants are going to be fulfilled. And it can get very, very stressful very, very quickly. You eventually did step down from your role there at TA and went a different direction for a while. Any wisdom now that even that dust has settled, and you're back in the nonprofit world now in a different area, but any wisdom that you can pass on for longevity, for people to be able to stay engaged and not necessarily feel the need to have to change careers. Is there a way, or is that the only way out, or do we do need to shift gears and go a different direction at some point?
I mean, it's what a great question, and I could think of a couple maybe relevant things to say, but I think the most important thing might be remembering that sort of the foundational reason of why we do the work. If you're reading your Jane Jacobs, or you're reading your Jan Gehl, you get a sense that they really celebrate and really genuinely enjoy the fleeting moments of eye contact with strangers. Or, Jan Gehl used to tell this story of being in Venice, virtually a car-free town, and hearing a mother call for her children, like a mile away, and just like the humanity of that. So you've really got to dig that stuff on a deep level, and I think that really keeps one going even when times are hard.
It sounds like what you're saying is. It sounds like what you're saying is also holding on to the why.
Holding on to the why, and then realizing that there are moments throughout the course of your day, even if it's a dangerous, congested street or an otherwise sort of like, not so idyllic setting, there's still some humanity there to recognize and celebrate, and I think that's what I think kept me going. But I was also supremely lucky, Jeanette Sada-Khan shows up as the transportation commissioner. It's just like, okay. But yeah, there are a lot of tough times. And so you've got to celebrate your small wins. You've got to celebrate those small humane moments that might turn you on in the first place. And then it's just the people. I mean, what have we done so far in this podcast? We've just been like talking about all these wonderful people that we get to rub shoulders with, so that's what it's about. You've got to be having a good time. The arc of history is long, and until it bends your way, you've got to just like enjoy what you can. Yeah.
So right around, when was it? 2017, 2018? Is that when you made the move over to Bird?
In 2018, I left transportation alternative after 14 years. I was like thinking, I've been in this job for a while. There's all these young Jedis, coming up, and I was feeling a little irrelevant. And I was like, okay, maybe I need to try something new. And so, I joined the micromobility revolution, all of the bike and scooter sharing that was happening. And it was an exciting time. And, as we now know in retrospect, it was pretty frothy.
Yes.
A lot of
because it was two different stints, right? It was Bird first, and then
Super Pedestrian, which in my heart of hearts, I really wanted Super Pedestrian to succeed, because it was this MIT startup that had this beautifully designed scooter that was and they had a lot of urban minded folks on the team who were really in it for the right reasons. They weren't just trying to get rich quick.
Well, and what I appreciated about Super Pedestrian, and we did have them here in Austin, is that they also were taking a different tact. The sort of break things first tact of early micromobility was them, dropping their units onto the street without permission here in Austin during South by Southwest, and then having them all confiscated by the city, and so it was definitely this mindset, almost kind of patterned similar to Uber and Lyft, sort of breaking models and breaking things, and then asking for forgiveness later. Super Pedestrian had the different tact of partnering with cities and doing things on the up and up, which I really appreciated. And I think the cities that did use Super Pedestrian, I think that they appreciated that too. And as you mentioned, also safer units, safer, actual micromobility devices.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful to see too.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, a lot of lessons were learned, and it's nice to see that, a lot of vestiges of that era have like sort of, evolved and improved and sort of gone on. And I think, what we have now in City Bike is amazing. And, there are still tough times where people are figuring out how to fund it. But, it's been said many times, it's really hard to make transportation profitable. It's essentially a public good, if you do it right. And so, I think hopefully now with City Bike, we recognize that, the subsidy per trip is much lower than a lot of other forms, pretty much every other form of public transit, right? So it really is deserving of public support.
So then along comes, the inevitable downfall of super pedestrian, and that happens. They do the end of that story was that they weren't able to continue, and again, lessons learned. Many others also went that way. But the other thing that happened for you too is similar to like Kate McKinnon, as you mentioned. It's very public that she's moved upstate. She's gotten out of the city, and so have you. And so now. This is kind of the view, the Paul Steely White view.
Yeah, it's like you see those pictures of highway interstates with no cars on them, and like the open road. This is like the Greenway Trail version of this, and it was actually hard for me to find this photo because this is the Wallkill Valley Rail Trail, which is very right through New Paltz, where we live now. My wife and 3 kids, and hi Zoe, how you doing? My wife Zoe, she's a poet. She has a new poetry book coming out. But so I love this canopy effect, right? It's like a Gothic arch of trees, and the trail just invites you in, and I just love it. And thinking back to the heyday of my work in New York and the Manhattan waterfront greenway, which was such a great spine to sort of build off of. We used to have this term greenway graduates, people who would start urban cycling on the greenway and then slowly get the comfort and the confidence to like ride on the street grid. And of course, we were busy trying to get the protected bike lanes to make that possible. But the Greenway Trail is so much, right? It's a park, it's a linear park, it's a transportation corridor. And increasingly, I think people are seeing these kinds of assets as, vital for public health, community health. In New Paltz, this is like our main street. You're out running or walking or riding on the trail, and you see your neighbors, and you stop and say hi. And increasingly, it's an economic development tool, right? And I think that's really what's on my mind these days as an advocate is how can we insulate ourselves from the sort of vagaries of the political culture and all the ups and downs? And I keep coming back to just documenting how much these greenway trails can, revitalize local economies, provide the kind of lifestyle and livelihood that people want these days, right? And that's something I think we're maybe going to get into a little bit here in a second. But the watchword is, or the watch phrase is, trail-oriented development. Of course, borrowing from TOD and really just trying to like figure out what's that basket of land use and zoning and, and parking and planning that's going to help unlock more value as communities continue to build out their Greenway Trail networks.
Yeah. I always, when I see an image like this, I always think that, the forest is just reaching out and giving you a hug. Richard Louv would be happy. It's like a connection with nature.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah. And it's really great just to, as and there's all this new research showing how important nature is for our mental health and our physical health. But you feel it in your bones. You go out and you feel it in your bones and you see it holds your attention, right? Not like digital stuff holds your attention, but it holds your attention in a really deep way. And I think people are really tapping into that. And of course, during the pandemic, the state park system here in New York State and our Greenway network was just being loved like never before, like skyrocketing visitation. And people, it's another, I think, silver lining of the pandemic where people discovered many of these places and they haven't stopped coming. The visitation has continued to skyrocket, since the end of the pandemic. So we're really seeing this flowering of interest in our public lands in New York State. And our job at Parks and Trails, thank you very much, is to continue improving these spaces. And my predecessor in this role was just a wonderful force of nature. Her name was Robin Dropkin. And she famously made the Empire State Trail what it is today, right? The 750-mile Outside Magazine called it the best Greenway Trail in America, going from Buffalo to Albany and from the Canadian border down to New York City. It's sort of like this T on its side. I think we might have a map here in a second. But Robin also famously saved the park system from ruin during the fiscal crisis in 2010 when they were going to shutter like 100 state parks. And she rallied the troops and went to the state capitol here in Albany and, stopped that from happening. And then stoked a reinvestment in the system so that when all those people came to these wonderful places during the pandemic, they had restrooms and facilities and water, and they just discovered how great the system is. So we owe a lot to Robin Dropkin.
Fantastic. That's great. Talk a little bit about the history of this organization and how does this work like with the official state, government of New York and in that model and how maybe other states and other provinces and other countries can kind of learn from this.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year at Parks and Trails, and it was really founded based on the realization that our state park system in New York is really like a national park system. I mean, there's really no big national parks in New York, and that's because more than 100 years ago, we sort of grabbed all these wonderful places and turned them into state public lands, and we just celebrated the centennial of the system last year. I think outside of California, it's the largest state park system in the country, and certainly the most grand. And there wasn't really an organization dedicated to ensuring that the system was healthy, that it was adequately funded, right? That local volunteer groups, we now have about 80 of these very vibrant friends groups who are stewarding and minding and taking care of their local park. An organization dedicated to keeping that whole apparatus going. And so Parks and Trails was founded back in 1985 to fulfill that purpose. And at the same time, begin to fill in the gaps on the Erie Canalway, which was just sort of a patchwork quilt of different sort of like on-road and off-road facilities. And today, that section from Buffalo to Albany is almost completely car-free, completely off-road. And so we have it's such a tourist destination now, but it's also increasingly a transportation corridor for Syracuse and all the other cities in between. And our job here at Parks and Trails is to continue improving the trail, but also linking up all these spurs and connectors so that every community in New York State is connected to the Greenway Trail network.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to pull up the Trails Across New York map here. We've got that. Let's zoom in on this so we can make sure that we get a good look at it. Okay, so this is a nonprofit that's helping facilitate and sort of curate and sort of like be that backstop, make sure that the funding is coming and that necessarily the quote unquote state government isn't forgetting about the fact that these are amazing assets.
Thank you. Exactly. And so, we're first and foremost that independent advocate that fights for the system. Right now, we're in budget season in Albany. And so we're fighting for a state budget that, funds the state park system for what it's worth, because it's worth a lot. In fact, the state park system here is more economically important than even the ag sector in New York. And if you know New York,
wow.
apples, dairy, right, it's a big deal. And so all of those people flocking to the system are spending money, and that doesn't even count the attractive value of investment, talent, people moving to to these places to be in an active town or an active community with parks and nature. And so we're always busy trying to document that value so that we can make a case here in the state capitol that we need to be funding the system adequately. I think we're making progress. This state budget this year, everything that's happening in Washington, everything we're hearing from the Governor Hochul, to the state legislators is that we're going to move in the opposite direction. We're going to invest more in these public lands and the state agencies that steward them, so that we never go back to the bad old days when they were hungry for money and when they were dilapidated facilities. And so we're an interesting organization because we do play that independent advocate role, but we also do a lot of work for the state. Okay. Planning, organizing, Greenway Trail expansion, cataloging all of the great efforts that are happening around the state. And then we also have a $2 million grants program where we get funding from the state budget, which we then on grant to these local friends groups, $50,000 grants for small capital projects, organization building, programming, right, that just really keep those local parks humming. And so it's an interesting tension sometimes that I didn't experience in New York, because at Transportation Alternatives, it's 100% independent funded. We can say whatever we want. We can be impolite if we have to be, but it's also New York where it's more bare knuckle. But here upstate, it's more about partnership and collaboration. But we do have a very clear advocate's stance on a lot of our issues. And I think people in government appreciate that, because there are things that they can't say that we can say, and we can do to point out when things aren't happening as they should.
Right, right. And in general, when you think about this, when you take a step back and you get out of the culture war sort of scenario that takes place when you're on the quote unquote mean streets of the city and you're fighting over limited public space in our roadways and our streets, things get, very ugly very fast, as we mentioned earlier, the lawsuits and the threats of lawsuits and all the drama that ensues there. When it comes to parks and trails and pathways, I make the point of saying, hey, these are beloved activity assets for, everyone. Typically, these are the types of assets that a community can have, little towns and villages and cities and rural areas as well as urban. These are they should be very popular across the political spectrum.
And they are. And that's such a salient point, because just looking at the Greenway Trail Network, right, and how people on all sides of the aisle believe in these places and see their value, it's a place to start, right? To, I think, heal our cultural wars and our differences, and align on a common vision for our communities, right? And so, because when you're talking about bike lanes in isolation or upzoning in isolation, it can, as you said, usually veer into very contentious territory. But when you start with the trail and this experience that everyone values, and then you start talking about connections to the trail and, what kind of community do you want to see grow up next to the trail, it's just a great, more sort of consensus conducive place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we've got a graphic on here that's looking at the New York State trail towns. And I believe there's a wonderful book. I think it's by Amy Camp, Trail Towns, talking about
this. We've learned a lot from Amy. Yeah, she's really, the beacon of this trail towns movement. I think it's a movement now, because others have followed suit. But this notion that local communities can get so much more from the trail with a little bit of technical assistance and cheerleading and partnership. And so we're very proud of the work that we've done, throughout the network here, helping, local towns get more economic value out of the trail, right? And more community value. So it's, placemaking, it's, amenities, it's marketing and programming. And increasingly, towns are asking us questions more related to planning and zoning, and oh, wow, we're starting to see a lot of developer interest in these parcels that are next to the trail. How can we leverage that interest and investment to further sort of create the communities that we want to see? And so, we've been working on defining what this trail-oriented development could mean in New York State. And it's very exciting, because we already have some great examples of mixed use, denser developments that face the trail, celebrate the trail. This is not New York.
No, this is. But this actually channels, going back to Yen Gale. This channels Yen Gale. This channels Jeff Speck. This, of course, is Carmel, Indiana, which is most famous for having the most number of roundabouts in their city. But this is the Monon Trail, and so this is incredibly impactful of how you can leverage a rail trail, the Monon Rail Trail, which is one of the, I believe it's one of the earlier Hall of Fame rail trails from the Rails to Trails Conservancy. And
love this example.
And this was just Mayor Brainerd had this vision after having visited over in Europe that, hey, we've got this wonderful opportunity to transform what's already a beloved activity asset into the heart of Carmel, Indiana, which, other than just a low slung main street, literally it's called Main Street, it is Main Street, there was no heart of the city, and now they have the heart of the city. So very much what you're talking about from a TOD perspective, a trail-oriented development.
Yes, indeed. I love the Main Street invocation there, because we're seeing that where trails are functioning as sort of the main meeting place and the sort of psychological and cultural center of gravity, for a community. And, I show this slide sometimes. I was in Syracuse last week at the planning symposium, and they're thinking a lot about the urban context of their trail network and also just, the more rural context. But what a wonderful vision there in Indiana to follow.
Yeah, and you don't have to go very far on the Monon, and then you're back in that enveloped in the forest too. So I mean, it's the combination. It's not to say one is quote unquote better than the other, but I love this concept of leaning into and understanding how these types of trails, trail towns, can really help from an economic vitality and vibrancy for municipalities, small municipalities, rural context areas can have an infusion of vitality and financial vibrancy. And there's just so many great things that can happen. And when you create an activity asset that gives so much, because it is encouraging people to get off the couches, get outside, get some physical activity in. As you mentioned, it doesn't have to be just recreation. It can be for transportation purposes as well. But then also a huge opportunity from a tourism perspective and from other financial vibrancy and vitality that these opportunities to be a quote unquote trail town or an active towns can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tourism really is small in comparison to the real estate and the economic development value of having companies, talent, individuals wanting to locate, wanting to be on the trail. And of course, as soon as you talk about the trail, proximate premium of 20% higher, real estate values, of course, we have to talk about displacement and gentrification and affordable
Absolutely.
housing. And one of my favorite trail-oriented development examples, it's right in my hometown of New Paltz now, which is a mixed use, dense for New Paltz, development, 4 stories, and affordable housing, baked in. And that's part of a specific zoning overlay for this sort of trail area in New Paltz, north of town. And that development has now spurred a lot of sort of copycat developments because it's been so oversubscribed. People are just like lining up to get into this building because it's right on the trail. You can hear the birds on the trail, from your upper story apartment there. And it's such a successful example of the kind of development that I think we're going to see a lot more of in New York State. So really documenting just what that has done for, local investment and vibrancy is, I think, so important. And that's what we're busy doing at Parks and Trails.
I'm really glad you mentioned that too, because it's the same thing that I talk about when we talk about trying to create an all ages and abilities network in a community. And if it's an underinvested neighborhood or community, there's concerns of gentrification and displacement. And my approach from an active towns perspective is that we have to invest in those areas. We have to make it easier for people to walk and bike and be able to get to meaningful destinations under their own power. So to not invest in that is not the right thing. We need to invest in them. We need to create better places, higher quality places for people to live in. And we need to have anti-displacement mechanisms in place. And so we need to understand that it's not a black versus white thing. It's not a, this versus that. We need to understand that we need to kind of do both. We need to gentrify. We need to improve the quality of life of these areas. But then we also need to make sure that we're not having unintended displacement of people. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good stuff. What haven't we talked about yet that you want to make sure we address before we say goodbye today?
Coming back to Don Shoup, I just want to say, Kingston, New York, which is just down the road here from us in Albany, and is the site of our fall Greenway conference. So the statewide Greenway conference that we're hosting here, creating communities, I think it's called, and Jeanette Sada Khan is one of our keynotes, as is Ryan Chow from Rails to Trails. And Kingston is a great place to have it because they just won the CNU award for their zoning, their new zoning code, which is pretty incredible. They eliminated their parking minimums. Thank you, Don, in Kingston. And they have a just wonderful burgeoning trail network. So Kingston used to have 3 cargo rail corridors coming into town there, and all of them are being developed into beautiful rail trails. And their form-based zoning code is really uniquely suited to these sort of funky little parcels that sort of sprout around the trails, like little triangular parcels next to the trail, because the code is really seeking to invite, accessory dwelling development, sites that wouldn't otherwise be developed, and not be too, prescriptive in terms of use, but just really giving people design guidelines so that they can just go ahead and build as a right. And so a very ambitious affordable housing agenda in Kingston to go with all of this, as you put so well a few minutes ago. Thank you. So yeah, come to Kingston in October. You can sign up on the Parks and Trails website. We'd love to see you. We'll be having, bike rides. We're also going to be screening a new PBS documentary about the Rails to Trails movement, and what's his name, Peter Harnick, who I think really helped spur that and get it going. And I think Peter will be with us for the conference as well. So looking forward to that. And then just finally, I would love to connect with other folks who have ideas about how we can continue to build out this sort of corpus of guidelines related to trail-oriented development. Making sure that development is preserving and improving public access, right? That, frontage and facade is really enhancing the trail experience. Looking at, public amenities and other sorts of, goodies that we want developers to provide in exchange for getting to build a little more densely next to the trail. And thank you so much for mentioning just the magic of trails and how they can sort of bring people at different parts of the spectrum together and maybe agree on, sometimes contentious issues around transportation and zoning and the rest.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye?
It's just been such a pleasure, and thanks for indulging the little bike ride down memory lane.
Oh yeah,
early on, that was fun.
That was a given. I mean, there was absolutely no way we were going to get away with that, just because of the fact that there's so much history there, and always wonderful. And any time I get an opportunity to promote one of Clarence Eckerson's old street films, that helps too.
So I'm going to see him next week. And, maybe if you don't mind, just one parting shot, just like what you've done to really build such a community and a movement around, baking in activity to our everyday lives into the built environment. It's such in some ways, it's simple, but just such a profound idea. And we're really trying to do the same thing with nature, right? Like going to a park or having nature in your life shouldn't be about, getting in a car and driving, 20 miles to a state park. It should be right outside your door. And so this idea that we can engender, smart, context sensitive development that's dense, but also, proximate to nature along trails is, I think, really an idea whose time has come for today with so much demand for natural spaces, coming out of the pandemic. And so this melding of the urban agenda and sort of the parks and green agenda, I think is very exciting.
I'm really glad you mentioned that too, because it's one of the themes that I harp on frequently here, is that we do ourselves a disservice if we are creating these wonderful and beloved activity assets, these parks and trails and greenways and pathways, and yet the only way that people can get there is to have to get into a car and drive there. And there has to be ample parking in there. And then there's all this tension of nearby neighbors. If there isn't, it's like one of the wonderful programs that has recently been, launched in the last few years from the Trust for Public Lands is, the 10-minute rule of being able to have parks and recreation and trails and greenways within a 10-minute walk from somebody's house. And when I had them on the podcast, one of the things that I emphasize is also thinking about a 5-minute bike ride or a 10-minute bike ride to those locations as well, and adequate facilities at said, trailheads, restrooms there, and safe bike parking facilities there, so that somebody can get into nature, enjoy that, use that transportation corridor, but also be able to ride one's bike to that location or through that location, through that facility. So I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it brings up a common theme that many trail towns and active towns are starting to embrace, is that you should have access to these wonderful activity assets from your doorstep. Get on your bike and be able to get there. Perfect
note to end on. But I'll just add one more thing.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely.
Because you mentioned TPL, Trust for Public Land, and we're so lucky to have them as a partner. We do tons of work with them, especially on the Long Island Greenway, right, which is trying to extend the Empire State Trail east from New York City all the way to Montauk. And it's such a wonderful project. And, TPL is also co-hosting the conference I mentioned so love the work that they're doing. And Open Space Institute, gotta mention them too, because that vision of having green space that's like networked, and so you don't have to drive a car, right? You can walk or bike. That's happening in Ulster County, right around New Paltz. They have a 250-mile Greenway Trail network that's fast, being implemented. And it's one of the reasons we actually moved to Ulster County, was because of this sort of like flowering of this Greenway Trail network. And so if anyone's interested in riding any of this, also on the ptny.org website, you can come and do Cycle the Hudson Valley or Cycle the Erie Canal, are two big marquee bike tours this summer. So multi-day tours. You can see the splendors of upstate New York and the burgeoning Greenway Trail network.
Yeah, I'm going to pull that up right here. So Cycle the Erie Canal and also the Hudson Valley is right there.
There you go.
Too.
Look, you had it right there. Oh my gosh, right at your fingertips. Thank you, John.
Oh, that's what I do. Paul, hey, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Paul Steely White. And if you did, please, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and ring that notifications bell. And again, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Again, just hit the join button down below right here on YouTube, or navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page. Several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my content. Okay, thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And again, just want to send a huge thank you to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel financially via YouTube memberships, YouTube super thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit and joining my Patreon. Every little bit adds up and is very much appreciated. Thank you all so much.